Thank you all, men, for being here today. We have a real special treat. Scott Gerlicher is commander of the Minneapolis Police Department. In 1986, you would have found Scott right here in these halls because he's a graduate from Minnetonka High School. When he was here, he participated in varsity track and cross country. So be careful, he'll chase you down. He attended Metropolitan State University, acquiring a bachelor's degree in law enforcement and a master's degree in public administration. Scott is also a graduate of the FBI National Academy in Quantico, Virginia. Also a graduate of the Senior Management Institute for Police at Boston University. Scott has been an officer in the police force since 1989, starting as an undercover narcotics officer in a local area high school. Over the past 24 years with the Minneapolis Police Department, he has served as a patrol officer, sergeant, lieutenant, inspector, and deputy chief. He currently serves as commander and oversees the department's Strategic Information and Crime Analysis Division. This division manages criminal intelligence and information flow within the Minneapolis Police Department. This includes monitoring over 100 public safety cameras throughout Minneapolis and managing other technologies that are designed to assist patrol and investigative divisions. Hey guys, come on in. By providing real-time crime intelligence and information. Scott lives in Minnetonka with his wife Carrie. They're the directors of the Minnetonka Eden Prairie Chaska Ski Jammer Ski and Snowboard School, which Scott just told me they just finished up. They have 3 daughters, one who's currently a sophomore at Minnetonka High School. Hey guys, come on in. Come on in, grab a seat. So if you won't mind, let's please give Scott a very warm Minnetonka welcome.
Well, thanks for the invitation to come talk with you this morning. I'm happy to be here in Minnetonka High School. I don't get around here too often, except for possibly football games in the fall or conferences, but it's great to be back. It's also nice to be present of all these nice young men as well as your sons. So thought I would talk to you today a little bit about my job, some of the experiences I've had, and what it means for me to be a man of character. You know, there's many aspects of character if you think about it, and what really I think differentiates somebody is it's easy to be and maintain that level of character when things are going well. But when things are chaotic, things go haywire, that's what really tests a person's character. And that happens to all of us, I think, in different ways. Now, on the Minneapolis Police Department, we have about 800 sworn police officers. And these are officers who are dealing with people in crisis every day. When you think about it, nobody ever calls 911, calls the police when things are going well. They only call us when they're having some of the worst days of their lives. When you think about it, they're either calling us because they've been a victim of a crime, they've been a witness to a crime, or when we arrive, we determine that they're a suspect of a crime. Now, being a police officer, you're constantly dealing with people in crisis, and it's easy to lose your perspective, to get negative, and to get, as I'll explain a little bit later, below the line thinking. So my goal for you this morning in the brief period of time that I have is to talk to you about a couple of different incidents that have taken place in the past few years with me and our department, relay some of the details of that and how myself and our department reacted under those times of stress. But before that, I want to speak a little bit more about some recent events. We recently just hired a new chief of police, Chief Janae Harteau. She just started here a couple months ago, but she has been a member of our police department for many years. Now she's, like any new chief, coming into our organization, trying to implement a number of different changes within our organization, changes which I think are all for the better. But like with any group, with any people, people are resistant to change. They're nervous about change. And if you'd ask cops what drives them the most crazy about their jobs, they'd tell you two things: the way things are and change. So thinking about that, brings kind of an interesting scenario for a new chief who's coming in to try to make change. It's kind of a can't win either way. One of the things our chief just recently did is bring together our entire department just a couple of weeks ago. 1,000 of us, that's 800 sworn officers and 200 non-sworn members of the police department. It took place over 2 days. We did it down at the convention center. She introduced our officers and our supervisors to a concept which I want to share to you today, which is based upon a book called The Oz Principle. And that book's written by Roger Connors, Tom Smith, and Craig Hickman. Now, there's a lot of leadership books, but this one has a lot of good concepts, and I just want to touch on a couple of them. Specifically, staying above the line in your way of thinking. Now, it's based upon the movie The Wizard of Oz, and I'm sure everybody's seen The Wizard of Oz, and if you remember back to the movie, there's a lion, a scarecrow, and a tin man, and each of them are searching for something they didn't think they had: courage, a brain, and a heart, respectively. When they finally make it down the yellow brick road to the wizard, they learn that there really is no magic wizard. It's just a man behind a curtain with smoke and mirrors. And the traits that they had inside them were just that. They were already inside them. They just had to pull those traits out of themselves. There was no magic wizard who was going to give them a heart, a brain, and courage. They just had to look within inside them to realize that. So, easy to say, how do we relate that to real people and real situations? Well, through the concept of what we call personal accountability and above the line or below the line thinking. Wanted to talk briefly about that. Below the line thinking. What is below the line thinking? That's victim mentality, thinking of yourself as a victim. Your problems are always due to someone else, not yourself. It includes crippling attitudes such as confusion, finger pointing. It's not my job, it's someone else's job. Ignoring it or covering your butt. Whereas above the line thinking involves a different concept. 4 things: see it, own it, solve it, and do it. To see it, acknowledge the problem that you're facing. To own it, assume responsibility for the problem and the results to fix it. To solve it means to formulate a plan and to remedy the situation, and to do it is to just that. To then put your plan into action. You can relate this to any situation, really, but they're simple steps, yet many of us tend to, in the course of our lives, when things go bad, fall below the line, think of ourselves as victim. Think of us in our poor situation versus rising above the situation that we're all in. So think about this for yourselves. Are you a person that when faced with an obstacle, challenge, or change in your life, do you think above or below the line? And when some of our police officers dealing with people in crisis every day, dealing with that stress, a lot of them had been thinking below the line. We're trying to bring them back up above the line. Things in their jobs, whether it's new policies, new procedures, it was always someone else's fault. It wasn't their own fault. They started to reflect some of those attitudes on some of the members of the community. And maybe that's true for some of you in the audience as well, in your line of thinking. But today, we're here with a group of football players and coaches. So let's think about this in football terms for a moment. Let's say you're playing linebacker and you miss a tackle of a running back that you should have made. Are you the type of person that's going to blame that on the defensive lineman who should have closed the gap and stopped that? Or are you going to take responsibility for your actions and after the fact, pull your teammate aside, talk with that teammate, and figure out a way to remedy that so that situation won't happen again? Are you above the line or are you going to be thinking below the line? Something that each of you can do, whether you're playing football or here in high school or in your jobs as a course of growing up. Now, during our department-wide meeting, we challenged all of our 800 police officers and staff to stay above the line. And today, I guess I'm going to issue all of you the same challenge. Think about that. And next time things don't go your way, stay above the line. Your teammates, you start to see them falling below the line, talk to them, bring them up above the line, to that line of thinking. See it, own it, solve it, do it. Now, the 2 examples I want to talk to you about today from my personal experience are the 35W bridge collapse in 2007 And then in 2008, we hosted the Republican National Convention. Two major events that had some similarities and vast differences as well. First, the 35W bridge collapse I wanted to talk about briefly. This happened in the early evening of August 1st, 2007. I had just arrived home from work and was just a mile down the street, and we had the news on in the background eating dinner, and it said that there was a bridge collapse involving the 35W bridge in Minneapolis. And I thought, well, that can't be right. There must be some, it was hot, maybe there's some road buckling or something. I didn't realize the magnitude of the situation until shortly after that time, my phone started to explode with calls and pages coming in, and it was then that I realized, wow, this is a really big deal. So I threw on my uniform and rushed downtown to the area there. And I will say, when I arrived at the scene about 20 minutes later, it was pretty chaotic. We were staged in kind of a parking lot of a Red Cross building, which happened to be real close to the bridge, but there was smoke rising from the area where the bridge had once stood. There was police, firefighters, paramedics running around everywhere. It had not been organized in any capacity, although there were some initial rescue attempts being made by some firefighters. But the first thing you tend to do when you arrive there, or at least I tend to do, is look around to see if there's somebody of a higher rank than you are to take control. And unfortunately, looking around, I saw another deputy chief at the time, and it was the two of us that were the highest ranking. So we realized that, wow, it's up to us to at least start to get this thing organized and put together some command structure so that we can start to get in there and rescue any survivors that may be in the rubble. So we did just that, and it wasn't easy to do that because people were streaming in from everywhere, as I said. But take a deep breath, and you start to go through a step-by-step process of trying to get things organized, figuring out where you need to send police officers, where firefighters are, and we ended up doing just that. We ended up having a 3-week operation, 24 hours a day, to deal with that particular incident. There were a lot of challenges. In that particular incident, there was 13 people killed. There were 11 hospitals throughout the entire metro treated about 100 different people for various injuries. So it ended up being a very significant event, probably one of the biggest disasters in the state of Minnesota. Some of the challenges that we faced, I'll touch on real specifically and briefly. One was establishing an incident commander for a large disaster like that. It really depends on a situation like that, on what the mission is at the time. When we initially arrived, it wasn't necessarily a police emergency. It was a fire emergency. It was a rescue operation. So fire took ultimate authority. But as the hours and days progressed, after the rescues were made, and in some cases were not made, that then changed lines of authority to being a police-led operation, mission-driven. But it was a challenge to get all that set up and organizing both police, fire, as well as EMS. Communication is always an issue, whether you're communicating amongst a group of teammates or whether you're communicating in a disaster like that. Setting up and establishing communication was key for us. We had elected officials coming in, and we had to communicate from the scene with our emergency operations center, where the mayor and the city council members were. The state of Minnesota was calling. Communication was a huge challenge for us, as was logistics. Because we knew this would be a lengthy operation. Whenever you have a big disaster and police and firefighters hear about it off duty, the first thing they tend to do is come into the scene. Well, that's great, but who handles the night shift? Because if everybody shows up now, this operation we know is going for days. And so we had to be very careful about calling our folks, sending some home that had showed up out of good faith, saying, this is a sustained operation. We have enough people now. We need you to come in tonight or tomorrow. We also had people self-responding from other suburban agencies that just wanted to come and help, and trying to get them organized, realizing they had different computer systems and radio systems. So those were a lot of challenges that we did face. Other issues that came up during the course of that event, which caused us problems, was that there was a Twins game taking place at the Metrodome just a few blocks away. So we had 40,000 people in the Metrodome at the time of this bridge collapse who were waiting to leave. And they heard about it, some left right at the scene. Added complication for us because the 35W bridge is just a few blocks away from the Metrodome. And then day 3 of this event, President Bush came. Now, that was a great gesture, but that's an added concern because anytime you have the President of the United States, it brings with it all those security concerns, which on top of dealing with a major disaster, now you have to try to deal with security for the President of the United States. Thankfully, that was a quick in and out visit, and it worked out relatively well, and we appreciated having the President stop on by. Come on in. So why don't we move on? I'll talk about the Republican National Convention briefly. What I'm getting at here is during this, for myself, having to try to organize some of this for our police officers, it's constant change, it's constant stress. There's a lot of ways to get down on yourself, to stay below the line, but you need to rise above the circumstances, again, that you're in. Now, the Republican National Convention from 2008 was probably the largest public safety operation in our state's history. It took place in over a week. It was headquartered in downtown St. Paul, as you may remember, at the Excel Center. But it was really a metro-wide event that drew worldwide, national and worldwide media attention. My job during that incident was to oversee crowd control operations for all the Minneapolis police officers involved. We knew through various media reports, as well as information we'd received on Twitter, Facebook, everywhere else, that we could expect some large-scale demonstrations and protests. Now, peaceful protests are one thing, but we also had information that people were going to be coming in trying to cause some damage and do what they could do to disrupt the actual convention itself, because if you're successful in doing that, well, then you make CNN. Convention shut down because of protesters. So their cause then gets front page news. We wanted to obviously prevent that from happening. Now the difference in this event with 35W is that's a spontaneous event. The bridge collapses, you all got to jump into action, whereas the Republican National Convention, we had over 2 years to prepare. So with that, it's good and bad because you have 2 years to prepare, but it also means there's higher expectations of performance because you have time to prepare versus being thrown into a chaotic situation. We did a lot of coordinating between St. Paul, Minneapolis, Bloomington Police, as well as the local sheriff's offices. We had a setup for the RNC organizational structure, similar to a military operation with divisions, platoons. We had to equip officers, about 2,000 officers, with the same type of uniform, the same type of riot equipment in the event they would need it, the same type of markings on their equipment and helmets so that we would know who they were and what agency they worked for and what rank they held, as we had, let's say, 300, 400, 500 officers on a line protecting a venue. We ended up having to set up a command post in St. Paul, and we had some helicopters flying above that were able to give us real-time feeds into that command center of where protest groups were moving. Some were relatively large, involving well over 500 people. And we were able to view their movements as well as the movements and where our various divisions and platoons were. It was kind of cool to watch, but it was a little frustrating for a person like me who was having to watch this, not being able to do anything other than radio and say, move your people over here and there. I would have rather been out on the front lines at that time. The other advantage that we had was that we had people inside those protest groups, so we were fortunate enough to know, usually before they took any action, what they were going to do. So we had undercover officers who were calling us on cell phones saying, okay, they're all going to turn right on 7th Street, and their goal is to go to the Excel and block the west entrance. Okay, well, we knew, so we would move people around and block their path in order to do that. We did have some property damage taking place in downtown St. Paul. Over the course of that convention, we ended up arresting well over 200 people, mostly people that just refused to leave the area, but there were some arrests for property damage, a few assaults, but nothing major. The other challenges that we faced leading up to the Republican convention were, I briefly touched on, trying to organize and come up with standardized policies and procedures and training for officers who would be working in a crowd control capacity. Because if you're a Edina police officer, you have vastly different policies, oftentimes than in Minneapolis. But we had to have, again, one uniform standard policy of how we would all respond as a group of police officers so that nobody was acting independently. On a football team, on a baseball team, on a police department, doing an operation like this, independent action is a no-no. You work as a team. Your actions are dependent on that of your teammates. And that is what we wanted to do. So how do we do that in advance? We had several training exercises in the months leading up to the Republican Convention at various fairgrounds throughout the metro area, where we brought in hundreds of officers as well as hundreds of role players from community colleges and other places to play the role of protesters, to try to test this out and see how our officers would act, see if we could get the formations going, as well as we got these role players involved in being as obnoxious as they possibly could right in the face of our police officers who were holding the line. Because we knew that they would have to be doing that out on the streets of St. Paul. And we didn't want them to see that for the first time and do something that they shouldn't have. So they were well prepared, well equipped at the time of that Republican Convention. The other issue, of course, is transportation. I mentioned this was a St. Paul event, but we had incidents and protests taking place both in St. Paul as well as in Minneapolis. Now try to move 2,000 police officers around the metro area. It's really difficult to do. And we learned a lot because prior to the RNC, I and some others had some opportunities to go to other cities like Washington, D.C., Boston, New York, places that were very familiar with protests, had previously had experience with other national level conventions, and we learned a lot. We ended up renting over, I think, 200 minivans to transport small platoons of officers around. And yes, we did buy the insurance, and it came in handy in a few cases. But traditionally, we had moved groups of officers around in Metro Transit buses, but with traffic and things, that would have been impossible. So we utilized these minivans, plain white minivans, traveling around in caravans all over the metro area, so we could quickly deploy to specific areas. The other thing we did is bicycles. We bought well over 200 bicycles and had a number of cops on bicycles that they could use. Very, very mobile, kept right up with the protesters. They loved seeing the bike cops because they weren't as threatening as a cop in full riot gear, but they were probably more effective, in my opinion, than a cop in riot gear because of their mobility. If the crowds would start to press on those bike officers, what do you have in front of you instead of a shield? You had a little bike. You pick up the bike and just hold off the protesters with your bike. It worked out great. We ended up also buying a number of those Polaris Gators to move around, and we had some of our SWAT team members with chemical agents in case things really went bad. They could zip around and launch chemical agents if need be. There was a couple occasions where they had to do that to disperse crowds. Logistics was another major issue for us. Try feeding 3 meals a day to 2,000 police officers, or providing restrooms for 500 cops that are standing out at an intersection. Came up with a few unique ideas. One was we had a couple porta potties that we put on a trailer, towed by a pickup truck that could just move around to areas where we were holding a line in a venue. Officers could simply get up and use those facilities and get back on the line. We have catering box lunches that we could have delivered. We had our own command post in Minneapolis for staging, as well as one in St. Paul, full security detail for that. It was an absolutely tremendous operation over the course of those 7+ days. So why do I tell all of you this? Primarily because it's changed. We were thrown into situations, and I was thrown into situations I had not dealt with before. In one case, a disaster. In another case, a major police operation. Having to assume a leadership and organizational role of something that I was not previously familiar with. Caused me a lot of stress, caused our officers a lot of stress in having to deal with this. But by staying above the line, by thinking that we could do this, and by taking ownership of the problems, and as they arose, everything didn't go our way. Plans never happen the way you want them to happen. But we were able to face those challenges. And in both cases, I think they ended up being very successful in the long run. A couple things to wrap up, and then I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have. So remember, as you're thinking about your own situation moving ahead, there's 2 roads you can follow: the road to success or the road to failure. The road to failure, again, that's below the line thinking. It's excuse-making, blaming others, confusion, having a wait-and-see attitude, or a feeling of helplessness. Remember, it's easy and it's normal to sometimes fall below the line. All of us are human. We're going to have bad days. But when you do, don't stay there long. Bring yourself back up above the line. And recognize when you or your friends or your family or your teammates are falling below the line, and try to work with them and get them back above the line. The second road is the road to success, and that is staying above the line thinking. Developing the courage to see the problems, the heart to own those problems, the brains and wisdom to solve those problems, and then developing the willingness to get out there and do it. And just get out there and take a deep breath and do it. So that's what I have to you today. Before I end, I wanted to also just briefly touch for our young men in the audience, our high schoolers, on a completely different topic, and that is careers in law enforcement. We have an aging police department because we haven't been hiring in many years, and we did a massive hiring back in the late 80s, and old guys like myself were being hired. So the average age of the Minneapolis Police Department now is over 40 years old. That means we all don't have that much time left to work. Over the course of the next 5 and 10 years, we're going to be hiring many police officers, not just in Minneapolis, but all over the metro area. So my little plug for recruitment is that if you have ever thought about a career in law enforcement, I would think that it would be a good time, being a junior, senior in high school, to be thinking about that. College would be key, so keep that in mind. Most police departments are moving to a 4-year degree in law enforcement to be hired. So I would encourage you to think about that. And if you are thinking or are considering a career in law enforcement, I would also leave you with this. Remember, the decisions you make today oftentimes can come back to help you or haunt you in the future. So if you get involved in something you shouldn't get involved in today and you want to be a cop in the future, that may or may not impact your ability to do that, because as obviously we look at character when we're hiring police officers. So all of us are young, all of us have made mistakes growing up, and it's part of being young. So don't think that by making one bad decision it would ever prohibit you from being a cop. But I just leave you with that and would ask that if any of you are interested, I'm happy to answer any questions about anything I've discussed today, careers in law enforcement, whatever questions you may have moving ahead. So with that, I'd just like to thank you all for your attention.
Scott, you'll take some questions now?
Yeah, if anybody has any questions.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
You talk about the line and thinking above the line or thinking below the line. Personally, myself, I find when I find myself thinking below the line, I have a hard time getting myself to be aware of that and then to shift it so that I can start thinking above the line. Are there, how would you go about once you find out, oh, hey, I'm feeling this way, I must be thinking below the line. How do you get yourself to turn it around? What is it that you do personally for yourself?
Well, that's a great question, Phil. I think that happens to all of us. And the first thing, as you said, is realizing that you are thinking about below the line. But think about what things you can control and what things you can't control. And that's what I tend to do. When something happens in my life that I don't like or don't think is fair, is that something that I can control? Because oftentimes it's nothing that you can control. And so why spend your life, why spend your time worrying about something that you have no control over whatsoever? What do you control? That's what I try to tend to focus on when I recognize that I'm feeling in a way that I need to do something to get out of my funk. I know I control my own attitude. I know I control my own work ethic. Those are the things that I have control over. And so that's what I try to focus on, is the things that I can control, and getting myself and realizing that It's a choice. Every day when you get up, you choose, am I going to have a good day or a bad day? I choose to have a good day. You can make that same choice. In spite of the situation that you may be in, you have the ability to make that choice and be your own champion. Yes, sir.
Relative to social media and what you've seen out there, what advice would you have for these guys?
Everybody uses it. You know, I would just say be careful of what you post on there, because many employers, to include police departments when they do background investigations, search those social media sites and see what pictures are on there. For many years I was in charge of hiring of all of our police officers, and I know we had just hired a police officer who was still in our training academy, and there was some pictures posted on Facebook of that police officer who was out partying, and they were in a vehicle, and they had pictures of themselves with a bottle of beer in the vehicle driving. That person is no longer a police officer. So, I mean, there's going to be pictures posted on there. Be careful of what you're being photographed doing, obviously, and be careful of what's on your own social media sites. But that's a good point to remember, is just consider that all that information is public once it's on the internet. So if you're comfortable with your mother and dad seeing that, and any prospective employers, that's a test you can personally use to see whether or not that should be on there. And if you are, then great. Yes?
Just a quick one. Asked when we're feeling below the line, but he asked what we can do. What about if somebody else, a friend, is feeling below the line? Last thing they want to hear is, hey, you're being down. How do you help them?
Well, I think you can, and you should, talk to your friends, talk to your teammates, because you recognize it. Oftentimes before, they will recognize that. And it's not as simple as you say it, as just going up and saying, hey, you're not acting right, or you're below the line, let's get you back above the line. But talk to them, find out what the problem is. Reiterate to them what I just tried to iterate to you. You know, and I'll do this with police officers as well. When I'll be talking with them about a job performance issue or something, I'll say, what you're complaining about, you have no control over. Let's worry about what it is that you have control over, and your specific job, and what you can do to improve. You can spend all your time complaining and stressing about things, again, that you don't have any control over, but this is things that you can tell to your own friends and talk to them about it. More often than not, they're going to realize, you know, you're right, I never thought about that. I don't have any control over this. Life is too short to worry about things that you can't change. Let's start worrying about the things that we can change and reflect a positive attitude to make those changes. So that would be my advice, is to be very specific with your friends, with your teammates, about things that they do have control over to make those changes. Okay, well, thank you again very much. It was a pleasure to be out here.
Gentlemen, thank you. I don't even know if that's on. Thank you for being here. Let's give Scott one more big hand. We are going to see you guys next month. This was the end of our February mentoring of the month. We've got March, we've got April, and some more really good men of character coming in to share some more life stories with you. I hope we get to see you all there. Have a great day. Thanks for being here.